Hello, everybody. Welcome to the Tablas Creek Wednesday Instagram live broadcast. I am, as always, Jason Haas. We are inside our office today. Normally I do this outside, but today it's raining, and that is lovely. We'd had a stretch of very dry weather going back into late January, and so this is super welcome. But it does mean that my normal backdrop of our patio and our vineyard behind me is not there. So I apologize. I'm super excited for my guest today. It is Hardy Wallace of Dirty and Rowdy Wine. And he and I have known each other for a really long time, back to his days in Atlanta as a wine blogger. I'm excited to talk to him about his journey into wine and what he's working on now. He's one of our fellow Mourvèdre lovers, paths on the path of Mourvèdre enlightenment. So I'll be inviting him to join shortly, but while we wait for everyone else to sign on, I wanted to show you a few pictures on what we're working on. I did get out into the vineyard a little bit. It is really pretty out there with the green everywhere. So let me give you a couple senses of what this is like. So this is what it looks like out there right now. And this is a huge change from what it was like even 2 weeks ago. It was much less green, but this lots of lovely cover crop growth. The rain that we're getting today is only likely to be accelerating it. We have finished pruning, so we are ready really whenever it wants to start raining. Whenever it wants to start sprouting, we're ready to go. It also means that we don't have to slow down with this rain, which is great because there are times where we're not done yet in early March. Don't really have a choice. Some of the other stuff we're working on out in the vineyard, we are working on making our own biochar. This is a way of turning organic matter into kind of a charcoal-like substance that you can put on your vineyard that helps improve your soils and helps improve water retention. This is a pit that we have dug. We have a couple of pits that we're using. You can see one of the piles that's currently, I don't know how well you can see the smoke in that, but it's currently smoking. Basically, we're filling that pit with, in this case, vine cuttings, and then lighting it. And once it's fully lit, then we're covering it and essentially smothering that, which turns it to charcoal. It means that you don't have these burn piles that fill our valley with smoke. And it means that you have this great material that you can put on your vineyard. It's one of the great ways of doing some carbon capture. You can see maybe some of the piles that we have still to go. It's what we're doing with all of our vine prunings this year. A couple more vineyard shots just to give you a sense of how pretty it is. You can see, again, lots of green growth. We're starting to try to knock back the growth underneath the vines, just making our first few tractor passes. And it's just lovely out there. In the cellar, we're working on blending. So we're putting together the reds that have been aging in barrel, and we'll be bottling those next month. We're also bringing down our whites. We're going to be sitting around the blending table next week, turning all of the different lots from last year's harvest into the 2020 white wines. And then finally, something fun. We've got a new Australian Shepherd pup in the cellar. This is Holly, who is our assistant winemaker Craig Ham's new dog. So that's always fun. Cool. Okay, I'm going to get rid of the pictures. I'm going to invite Hardy to join. Questions. Okay. Scrolling back. Cool. Go live with Dirty South Wine. Hopefully Hardy will see this and enjoy it on.
Hey, Jason.
Hey, buddy.
How are you doing?
I'm doing great. How are you?
Doing wonderful. Great to see you.
Good to see you too.
Yeah. Thanks for having me.
Oh, please. My pleasure. It's those of us who are really going hard after Mourvèdre are rare enough in the world that it seems a shame not to share the spotlight as much as we possibly can.
Thank you.
So I would love, I was trying to figure out when we first met. It was in Atlanta. I feel like it was like 2003 or 4 or 5, something like that.
It was right around, I think, 2005. You were doing a tasting at a little wine shop called Eno.
Yep.
Yep, on Peachtree Street. And I remember meeting you, tasting the wines. It blew my mind. And you were really one of my first gateways into California Mourvèdre. And I bought a bottle of the 2003. I actually bought two. I sent one to my sister illegally, who's living in Florida. And we both drank it the same night. And we're like, holy, expletive. And that kind of, set some sales for us.
That's super cool. I didn't actually even know that origin story. So whatever, breaking news on Instagram Live. Um, so when did you start actually blogging about wine?
So right about then, so it was right about 2005. So I was, I'd been a wine lover since really right after I got out of college in '96. And when kind of social media really started to explode in the mid 2000s, I loved wine so much that I thought, hey, it might just be a cool way, just even on a personal, just kind of to keep track of things, but in kind of a public, resource. Start blogging about wine, and I had a very unique approach to it. It was not your typical flowery wine talk. It was, Dirty South Wine, which is still my Instagram handle for my personal stuff, and had kind of an Atlanta kind of angle to it. And that was, mid 2000s, and I kept that up really until I moved here in 2009.
There was a cool comment on Twitter that Meg Maker made when I posted that we were going to be doing this Instagram Live. And she said that you were playing jazz at the time that all of the other wine bloggers were just learning to play scales.
I love that. That's great. Thank you.
Which I was like, that's so perfect.
Oh man, that is super cool. Well, I was the great thing I think with whether it's following, a path in winemaking that may not be your typical approach, whether it's following, wine blogging, it is finding those spots where you can have your own voice and you can have your own essence that's poured into it, that creates something different, that whether or not other people follow, your path or not, it's all your own. And it's something that, you can, wine is still a spot you can find your own, you can find your own creek or so, and hope it leads to the ocean.
It's interesting. I've always thought that wine, it's like the perfect product for long tail marketing. In that, like, you don't need a winery like you, winery like us. We don't need millions of people who know us and our fans. You got a few thousand dedicated people. That's honestly, this is a perfect product for that.
It really is. And that's what I've always thought. There's an essay by a kind of former tech writer, a guy named Kevin Kelly, different than the Kevin Kelly who I used to work for in winemaking, but it's called 1,000 True Fans. And I think about that all the time, where it's like, that's for someone our size, only a couple thousand cases. That's really what we need, is just people, core 1,000 fans that, are enough for us to, keep going deeper and deeper with our craft, and people that really, geek out and love and follow that every bit of our adventure, because it's part of their adventure too.
So talk a little bit, if you would, about your transition from
If you can hear me, it looks like we just lost.
Okay, I hear you.
Okay, now
again.
we're back.
Maybe back?
We are back.
Okay. So talk a little bit, if you would, about your transition from writing about wine, writing about other people's wine, to wanting to make your own.
Well, it was something I never thought. When I was writing about wine, making wine was never even a concept. I always was completely under the impression that no matter, even if you did it with as minimal intervention as possible, it still required deep science, and you had to be a chemist at heart to actually make the art. And I always like to say I was an incredible student in all the creative matters and in writing and philosophy and stuff. But when it came to science, like hardcore science, even with a tutor, I got a D- in chemistry. And so I was like, that is never my path. So it didn't cross my mind at the time. But when I moved out here in 2009 shortly after, I began working for a winemaker, a guy named Kevin Kelly, who was the winemaker for Lioco at the time. He had his own label, Salinia. And he and I really worked together in a project called the Natural Process Alliance. And Kevin and the assistant winemaker, a woman named Angela Osborne, who has her own label, A Tribute to Grace, really encouraged me. They're like, the best way to learn this is actually to do it for yourself. And I was like, no way, I can't figure this out. And they're like, no, like the best thing you can do is like get a ton of grapes, and while you work on everything for, your day job in the cellar, you'll make your stuff at night, and you can kind of apply that or not apply that. And I was too dumb to say no. So I was like, all right, I'll do it. And that's really where it started. And it was really that first like native fermentation that kicked off. There was like, holy crap. Like, it grabbed that part of your heart and your soul that there was no going back. And you're like, I can figure out the science. There's labs if it's beyond my, capabilities, but I can learn that part. But this part here is the part, like, it changed my life right then and there.
So there's a big difference between a ton of grapes and your own wine label and like a self-sustaining business. How did the growth feel?
Wow, yeah, scary as all can be, because we started, vintage one was 1 ton of, high elevation Mourvèdre from the Alta Mesa section of Santa Barbara Highlands Vineyard at 3,200 feet elevation. And it was like, hey, this could be interesting. And then once we finished fermentation, it was like, oh, like this is exactly what I want to drink. Or this is, this was the direction that we were always looking for. And, kind of happenstance, the pick of a great vineyard, kind of an alternative fermentation method that we took with it, doing Mourvèdre, kind of partial carbonic, because we didn't know any better. And all of a sudden that saying like, wow, this is something that's delicious and wonderful. And going back to, we don't need thousands of, tens and 20s of thousands of customers. We only need a handful. Maybe this is viable. And so once we finished that first vintage, it was like, okay, this has legs. We went from like 1 ton to 7 tons to 14 tons. Then, at our peak, 80 some odd tons or, 85 tons. But it really was that, catch the tiger by the tail and don't let go. Not because, it'll run off, beyond you, but it'll turn around and eat you if you let go. So we just kept running with it. And well, now this will be our 12th vintage. And here we are. I'm kind of in the barrel room. We operate out of a custom crush facility here. So I'm in my stacks, if you will, right here. And 12 years later, who knew?
And so did you know when you started that you wanted Mourvèdre to be your focus, or did it grow out of the fact that it was Mourvèdre that first year that happened to be what you worked with?
Yeah, it really grew out of that fact that it was what we had access to the first year. When we started in 2010, it was such a weird vintage, and I'm assuming it was pretty weird in Paso too.
Cold.
But up here, it was cold, but marked by those 2 intense heat spikes. One on Labor Day that was kind of that 108, 109 degrees up here. And then second one, third week of September. We were going to make vintage one skin fermented muscat, because why not? I'm really glad I didn't do that vintage one now, but that got sunburn in the first heat spike. And then we had a backup plan of some old vine Petit Syrah, some white Zinfandel. We were going to make this ripping Zinfandel rosé, not off dry, but like, super high acid. That rotted in the rain, and it was like one disaster after another. And the only thing that was left that was off of like a compelling vineyard were these 2 rows of Mourvèdre at Santa Barbara Highlands Vineyard that no one had ever picked, because they were virused pretty heavily. And they were like, you might not get it to 23 bricks or so. And I'm like, that sounds great. Perfect. Not knowing any better. And so we really approached, Mourvèdre kind of like the lighter reds that I was drinking mostly. So like, I was drinking tons of Cru Beaujolais, a lot of red wines from the Jura, some lighter Cab Francs. And we thought, well, maybe we can kind of approach it in this way. Everyone thought we were ridiculous. Even the person I worked for was like, I don't think Mourvèdre's going to do that. And, I kind of Forrest Gumped it, just really like, or Matlocked it. You're kind of like, I'm not a smart man, but Your Honor, I think. So it really was this weird thing that fell into our laps. And what we've discovered while working with Mourvèdre, both that first year and then we started picking up additional sites, year 2, 3, 4, and 5, up to like 9 Mourvèdre vineyards at a point, was that one of the beautiful things about the grape variety, and I mean, you will know far more than I do, is the incredible spectrum of flavors that it has. It makes the most compelling rosé wines in the world, and it makes some of the most intense, long-lived, like soulful, deep red wines in the world. And there isn't much of there isn't really a blind spot in that spectrum. So if we can find sites that can express, some of them express that kind of blood orangey, citrusy, kind of fragrant floral side of the rosés. Some have that deep, dark, meaty side of that maybe more traditional or more typical, like dark red, black, Mourvèdre that we're used to. But if we can find those sites that express that range, and that's when we started adding sites from all over California, from Santa Barbara County to almost Humboldt County, the Sierras, Monterey, San Benito, Contra Costa, etc., and really to find that kind of that beautiful canvas or that palette that Mourvèdre can create. And that's been a now a 12-year journey, but we really jumped into that. I think vintage 3, we already had 5 or 6 Mourvèdre sites, all bottled on their own. And just because it just felt right. And, and again, we kind of created, like, at the time, there weren't a lot of people doing more than one. People may have had a lot of Mourvèdre blocks or vineyards, but not a lot of people were bottling, more than 1 or 2. And if you found someone that had 2, it was pretty ridiculous.
Yeah, for sure. Mourvèdre is such an interesting grape because of the journey, the historical journey that it's been on. I had a conversation a while ago with Morgan Twain Peterson about this. He sent me a copy of the old ampelography that was written just before phylloxera hit California.
Yeah.
The 1884, I think, the Charles Wetmore ampelography. And it talks about Mourvèdre as being this grape that like nearly every vineyard in California would benefit from. And these predictions that it would be on this like steep rise. And then phylloxera hit. It turned out it didn't graft successfully onto a lot of the rootstocks that were available at the time. Yeah. Other things just kind of got established, and it essentially like had 100 years in the desert before kind of being rediscovered in the 90s and 2000s.
Well, yeah, and you all were a huge part of, I think, really that kind of that revival of there's but there's a lot of plantings, obviously, back from the 1800s that, we work with, Morgan works with, a lot of stuff that's old, but there wasn't a lot of stuff that was being, newly planted, it seems like, kind of in that period of 80s, 90s, and, 2000s. It was, kind of like, here's the old dogs. But fortunately, like, most of the new plant material we use is all Tablas clone, is all stuff that, that you all are responsible for, which is incredible.
And that was one of the things that my dad and the parents kind of decided early on, is that, Mourvèdre, which it's still a little bit of a risk, even with global warming, it's a little bit of a risk in Châteauneuf-du-Pape dedicating a big chunk of your vineyard to Mourvèdre, because like 2 or 3 years a decade, the rains start before the Mourvèdre gets ripe. Like you are recognizing that there will be years where it's not going to come in, and you're just going to have less fruit if you've dedicated a big chunk of your vineyard to Mourvèdre. But them realizing that in California, like, it doesn't really rain until mid-November, when you're down this far south. And if you need to wait to let it get ripe, you just wait.
Yeah. Even with us, like in 2019, one of our vineyards, N's Vineyard, which Morgan also works with, but in San Benito County, 100-year-old, own-rooted, dry farm Mourvèdre that we work with. In 2019, I think we picked it November 2nd. It was the hardest time we've ever really had with that vineyard getting it ripe. But even then, I mean, the canopy had fallen apart. So it was kind of like we had to pick it. But even then, we're still able to make like an incredibly compelling wine that's like 12.7 alcohol, like completely wonderful. It's its own expression, but like it wasn't necessarily the wine we were looking for. but in a vintage that like basically like we're pushing out till November, and we usually pick this vineyard mid-September. Like it is like it's still, even in a cold, difficult year for ripening for that block, it's selling wine. And yeah, it's really, in only a few areas have we ever really had a hard time of like, I don't know if we can use this for red wine. And maybe out of 12 years, maybe two different places. So I think it's a grape that's perfectly suited to so much of California.
Yeah, I mean that's validation of Wetmore's analysis in 1884. I mean, it really is beautifully suited for here.
Yeah, and I think the other thing that I think is really interesting too is depending on where it's at. So with some of the sites that are longer, that have longer hang time or take longer to come in due to where they're situated, sites like in Contra Costa County, because there's no risk of frost, vineyards there get pruned fairly early. So even though we make some of our biggest wines, they're our first picks. And in years like 2017, where we had incredible and devastating fires all over California, but definitely up here in Northern California, and then 2020, both those years, 17 and 20, we were able to pick our oldest vine site 3 weeks before fires started. So even though we may have challenges in some of our other blocks, like we've got some of the best Mourvèdres we've ever made from some of our some of our hardest vintages. And it's so crazy because, again, it's this wild thing that it's resilient, but depending on where you've got it planted, it can come in super early, super late, and still make wonderful, soulful wines.
Awesome. So how many different vineyards did you work with like just last year?
So last year was a little bit smaller because with COVID, we did cut down our production a bit because of we had to basically take out a lot of our stuff for BTG or by the glass sales. So it would be better to think the year before, I think 12 or 13 vineyards, and on those, I think we now have 7. We're down to 7 Mourvèdre vineyards. So we were up to 9 at one point, and then 2 just stopped kind of cutting the mustard for us. They just were. I don't want to work with a vineyard unless it's got the capabilities to stand on its own. We do make a blended Mourvèdre as well, but if it doesn't have that potential to also shine on its own, I don't want it to. I'm not really at our size interested like in a workhorse vineyard that is kind of like the core of a blend. And 2 of them just seemed like they were. We had some changes in farming and changes of ownership that we ended up passing on those. So, but we were still on the hunt, the hunt for great Mourvèdre.
How far do you roam to get it? Do you still come down to Santa Barbara and Paso on the Central Coast?
So we gave up Santa Barbara in 2017, I think, or 16 was the last vintage for Santa Barbara, and then we come down to Chalone VA on 101. We don't work in Paso yet. We have been actively searching over the past few years for something that really calls our name. So if you ever hear of anything that is that rhymes with Mobla's Reek, hey, we're interested. But so we are definitely on the search there. But then we go up to now the Sierra foothills, so El Dorado and Amador, San Benito County, Monterey County, Contra Costa County, and I think that is it at the moment. So
that's it. That's all. Like only like half of California.
But we were looking at we had a block of Mourvèdre that was planted for us in technically Santa Barbara County, but just right across the street from the Santa Rita Hills line. But that got caught up in the Graciano mix-up. So it was 100% Graciano as opposed to Mourvèdre. So we unfortunately walked away from that because we were so excited for this block. But yeah, we were definitely still in the hunt.
I think there's a lot of the Mourvèdre in Paso that is actually Graciano. A lot of the stuff that was planted in the 2000s, with people talking about this great new clone of Mourvèdre that, yeah, it's quite different from the other Mourvèdre clones because it's not actually Mourvèdre.
Exactly. And not that I think Graciano is super cool. I
Yeah.
just don't want to drive 7 hours a couple times, a week during the peak season for the wrong thing.
Yeah. No, it's its own issue.
Yeah.
Um, so what are you looking at? What are you looking at doing that you haven't done yet? Like what's next?
Wow. It's funny. As much as I would always say, like, we'll never do anything, like, anytime I say we'll never do something, we end up doing it. Like, so really based on necessity, last year we made, I always said I would never make rosé, ever. Because I'm like, it's too much work for too little money for something that has a shelf life that has, a perceivable shelf life. And I'm like, I'll just drink other people's rosés. But because of the fires and things, we made a lot of rosé last year. And we made rosé from like 100-year-old dry farmed own rooted vines. That's insane. I am
Yeah.
so psyched for it. And it's one of those things that, yeah, maybe we won't make a lot of it every year, but it is so, like, again, if we're looking at that, kind of really diving into that full palette of Mourvèdre, it is something we will do more of. But I do like almost that Chateau Simone kind of approach to it, where I'm like, I actually haven't bottled my 2020 rosés yet. I'm sitting on top of one of the barrels right now, and I love, like, when you go to Bandol or you go to certain cellars where they're like, you want to drink some old rosé, and you're like, oh yeah, like, and you get that opportunity, like whether it's like at Terra Brune and they pull out, like, oh, here's some stuff from like 1983, and you're like, and those wines are incredible. And that, not that we're gonna make rosés to age 40 years, but that idea that if we're working on the right spot with vines that are that have vines and soil that have that kind of soul and that, those qualities to them, that we can make wines, whether they're red, white, or rosé, to lay down, that have that interesting life regardless of kind of the consumer impression of the shelf life. Oh, you got to drink it by Labor Day. So ageable rosé is one way we're looking. But one thing that I think I've got it right back here. One thing we just started playing with in my Sonoma-Cutrer barrel there.
Right.
And one thing that we work with for the last few years that I've been really excited about is actually Old Vine Barbera. And there's a lot of it up here. And we work with a lot of, like, Old Vine Petite, Old Vine Carignan, and Barbera, especially in these years that it's been a little bit hotter. The amount of acidity that it basically holds on to, and it just never seemingly gets, at least for us in the spots we've worked with it, never seemingly getting overripe. But it's one of those things that if we're really seeking freshness and ripeness, I think it's such a cool grape variety to work with. The challenge is the acid can be almost too high, where this is about 14% alcohol. I think it's 13.8. We picked it like in mid-October. The finished TA is 9.1, and the pH is 3.2. So it's kind of, whoa. It's not for everybody, but it's for me. So I think looking at some varieties like that, but Mourvèdre will always be kind of the heart and soul of what we do. And we do have, like, I always jokingly say there's like a multi-faces of Dirty and Rowdy. We've got the skin fermented side, the Semillon side, Old Vine Chenin, Old Vine Petite and stuff, but Mourvèdre's always been the core. And I think for us, the dream is to really plant our own. And we're still a few years away from that. But it's finding those spots that just have that kind of, for me, a spot that it's really magical to me is kind of, it's in the Fairplay region of El Dorado County, kind of right above Skinner. There's a quality to those wines that is this, almost like, it really brings out this kind of like crunchy, pomegranate-y, feeling of Mourvèdre. It's that kind of light red fruit in a very sturdy wine. And it's just something that, like, every time, whether we make wines from those vineyards or that region, or I drink one, you're just like, oh man, there's something where I don't get that quality of Mourvèdre from anywhere else in the world. and it's like that's someplace I really want to sink my teeth into at some point. So I hope land prices stay relatively low there for the next couple of years, and yeah.
Well, we've heard it here first.
Yeah, exactly. And but what I meant by El Dorado County, I meant El Dorado County in Idaho. This is this other section there.
Yeah, I love your description of the way that Mourvèdre can be both deep and dense and substantial, and also have these like pretty high notes. Like we always talk about it as being like meat and earth and loam and chocolate and rose petals. Like it's got this kind of surprising personality that is I think beyond what often people think of its use when they only think of it as a blending grape, and they think of it as tannin and structure and resistance to oxidation. And it is that, but it's not just that.
Absolutely. It can be it can be that, like it can be so many things. And it's almost like when we think about the curse of Syrah, maybe, 10, 15 years ago, where people were like, well, I don't know what to expect with it. Is it going to be this big, super dense thing, or is it going to be kind of light and ethereal? And that's actually part of the beauty of it, is that it's a grape variety that can have so many different personalities and so many different aspects based on site, based on the producer, based on the vintage. And it just, for me, if we really get down to it, and I think it was maybe a couple of years ago, I heard a quote that was, for California, that Mourvèdre is more, or is more susceptible, or more is much stronger at showing terroir than even Pinot Noir in California. And that was something that I thought was really like, we never talk about Mourvèdre in those terms, at least in, not you and I, but I think in the global world of wine, we never talk about Mourvèdre as a terroir-driven grape. We talk about Riesling, we talk about Pinot Noir, we talk about Chardonnay and things like that, but we never really get down to it. And here in California, Mourvèdre, like if we line up, whether it's, I'm sure every block that you all have, whether it's all of our different vineyard stuff that's down in SB, regardless of how those wines are treated, there is this shining thing of soil that can come through all of those that isn't very common in California wine. And I think maybe we could say, like with other grape varieties, you see it as those wines mature and as those wines, get through their primary phase. But I think even in their primary state, Mourvèdre has a way of showing that's very unlike other red grape varieties. I'm completely biased, but I'm also right.
Right. I'm certainly not going to argue with that bias with your conclusion. I totally agree. And it's interesting comparing it to Syrah, where I feel like people point out the fact that Syrah can have a lot of different faces as maybe a negative for the varietal's acceptance in the California market. The nice thing is that Mourvèdre is sort of an inherently anti-commercial grape anyway. So it's not like any of us are trying to fit into the 12 other Mourvèdres on the grocery store shelf, because there is no such shelf. Yeah. So we have the freedom, I think, to make wines that we know are all going to be pretty small batches, and they're all probably going to go to people who are into the fact that they're going to be different from one another and going to dig that, instead of a corporate buyer who's like, I'm sorry, this does not fit into my profile.
Absolutely. And I think that's a huge part where Mourvèdre really has that advantage even over like a Pinot Noir, because there's so many expectations that come with Pinot Noir, where, okay, well, if it's coming from this area, it has to fit into, the West Side Road typicity, or it has to fit into the Santa Rita Hills typicity, or, and Mourvèdre is like, it's a blank canvas. And that is the part, especially as a young winery and as a young winemaker, I think it was the perfect grape variety to fall into, because there weren't that many reference points that someone could immediately point to on that wine list. So even with well-known producers like yourselves, it wasn't something like you said, there wasn't the Mourvèdre section that like, hey, we're going right here, and so it was still pretty unknown for folks. And not that I hope that it stays unknown, I just hope that mystery and that discovery part is still always part of the variety. Because it is for me.
Yeah, I think so. And honestly, I feel like that's probably a pretty good place to wrap up. I have like five more things that I wanted to ask you about, but we're already half an hour in. I try to keep these to half an hour, and it's been a total pleasure. So
Oh, Jason.
if people want to learn more about Dirty and Rowdy or about you, how do they do it?
Oh, the best way is to, I mean, even though I think I'm coming in through Dirty South Wine here on Instagram, you can either follow Dirty and Rowdy or Dirty South Wine, or not or, both are the best ways to do it. The website is dirtyandrowdy.com. Last time we updated it was 2017, so it is full of fresh information besides the current wines. But the best way is like we are so small. I mean, it's really on a full-time basis. It's just myself and my wife. If you go to the website, you drop an email. It goes both to me and my wife. The phone number on the website's my cell phone, and we are easy folks to get in touch with and easy to follow on social media. So, if you have any questions, always feel free to reach out. And Jason, as always, just thank you for helping start this journey, and it's great to see you all the time. So.
I had no idea that I started the journey in that way. It's like one of the coolest revelations I've gotten in one of these. So,
Oh no, 2003, and I stocked up on a couple bottles that I still have in the cellar. So looking forward to cranking those out sometime.
amazing. Cool. Awesome. Thank you, Hardy. Thank
Thanks
you,
so much.
everybody, for joining this. And I will see you all in 2 weeks.
Awesome. Thanks, Jason. Adios.
Bye.